Hi guys, back to talk more about fire. This time we're going to talk about adaptations of tree species in particular to fire. So let's go. Okay, so we talked about the importance of disturbance in ecosystems already. We said disturbance is necessary for regeneration, it's necessary to maintain diversity and health throughout the ecosystem. And so, fire is a type of disturbance, and many systems are adapted to have fire. And certain species that live in these fire prone ecosystems have certain adaptations that allow either the species themselves or at least progeny, like babies of the individuals that are alive during the disturbance, during the fire, to be able to continue to live on the landscape. Otherwise, they would no longer be here. So, one of the adaptations that a lot of the tree species that historically grew in this area have is that they have this really thick bark that acts as an insulator that protects the living part of the tree, which remember is that cambium layer. That includes that thin cell of phloem, that thin vascular cambium, and then the thin cell of xylem that's right between the wood and the bark. That's the part that's alive. That's the part that needs to be protected. And so if there's big, thick layers of bark that are multiple inches wide on big old trees, then when fire happens, fire can burn around the outside of the bark. It can even burn part of the bark. It can burn through maybe potentially multiple inches of bark. And the cambial layer on the inside will still be able to be maintained and will not be either eaten up or heated so much so that it will be killed. And so a lot of the big trees, like the big sugar pine trees, the big ponderosa pine trees, big Jeffrey pine trees, big Doug fir trees, all have this really thick bark, which acts as an important protector for the living part of the tree. Another important adaptation is something that's called serotiny, and I think we mentioned this briefly before, but serotiny is basically the idea that many plants have adaptations to wait for disturbance until they will actually release their seeds or come to sexual maturity and to be able to reproduce. And the idea is that the plant doesn't want to try to reproduce until it thinks conditions are really ripe for reproduction. And so, right after a fire, when all the competition is gone, over all the overstory canopy is gone, there's lots of sunlight, there's lots of exposed soil, that's a really great time for a seed to try to get hold and start growing. And so in the previous case we talked about, these big old trees have an adaptation to themselves as an individual survive the fire. But serotiny is more of a case where the parent will usually be killed by a high severity fire that comes through, but its cones that are on the tree will open during that event, and they'll release seeds, and then they will start to grow. And so their babies will come up and grow into the place where they particular are previously occupied after the fire takes place. And this is true of a lot of Western pine trees, things like knobcone pine and Monterey pine that grow along the coast. And lodgepole pine is what we call partly serotinous, particularly versions of lodgepole pine that are growing more in the Rocky Mountains. And so this is a particular adaptation to surviving not as an individual, but as a species when more higher severity fires come through. Yellowstone in 1988 experienced this really extreme fire. And it was, I believe, over a 1 million-acre fire that spanned multiple states, as the National Park of Yellowstone does. And it killed an enormous amount of trees. And of course, people were very concerned when this fire occurred because it devastated this landscape in this really significant way. And what they found was that right after the fire burned through, there was actually very, very rapid natural regeneration of all these partially serotinous lodgepole pine cones that had opened up and released their seed during this particular fire event. The seeds themselves had not been killed by the fire. And so there was a very rapid regeneration that took place, which is the natural process that we would expect to happen in a landscape that's adapted to this kind of higher severity fire regime. Another interesting fire adaptation is longleaf pine. Longleaf pine is a pine that grows in the southeastern part of the United States. And it grows when it's young in this little tuft that almost looks more like a grass than a pine. And it's basically like one tuft of pine needles. And it grows like this for many years. And then it waits until a fire burns across the landscape and burns up that little tuft. And once that happens, it sets off this biochemical reaction that causes the surface of the pine to shoot up, and it can grow as much as like 10 feet in 1 year. And that's because it has been developing this extensive root system in the period of time when it was in its grass stage while it was waiting for this fire to occur. And so because it has this big root system, it can grow very, very quickly. And then over just a few years, it will be able to be really quite tall and hopefully big enough and out of the way enough that it will be able to survive as an individual when the next surface fire comes through this area, which this area has a pretty frequent fire regime, just like parts of California do. So that's another interesting fire adaptation story. Okay, just some fun facts. That's all I have on that topic.